Welcome to And Ninthly,
an Inside Number 9 podcast.
with your host, me, David.
And me, John.
Hello, welcome to And Ninthly. This is the last episode in this particular series, and indeed the last episode of this series of Inside Number 9 that we'll be covering. This is the episode Wise Owl, which was on nearly 2 weeks ago now. We've left this one to sort of percolate for a little bit. It was on the 1st of June 2000. I forgot to say the year then. I didn't forget what the year was, just forgot to say the year.
You've done it again, haven't you? Swear you're having a real problem with remembering what year it is. It's stunning.
I was going to say
2002. Did you say?
I was going to say 2022, but that just sounded so ridiculous coming up. All right, 1st of June. No, I'm doing it again.
2022.
Help
is that
me.
better for you?
Yeah,
Does
yeah.
that help you?
That's
2022.
That's lovely. Yeah, this week John will be announcing the year. Standing in for me. My second will be taking this one.
2022.
Yeah.
22.
Oh, don't start that. So, final episode of the 7th series of Inside Number 9. One that we were both anticipating quite a lot. And I think there were a few reasons for that, weren't they? One was we made reference in the last episode to the fact that it was clear from the previews that they were doing something a bit different with this one. And I think we were both getting quite hyped about it, weren't we, when we saw that it was going to be at least part animated. That's kind of all we knew about it before we saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, by the way. Hello, David.
Right, yes, yeah. Wow, it's really going according to plan, this one, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, it's we've got some hot weather finally, so I think perhaps we're going a bit brain crazy. Yeah, it was really exciting to see them doing something completely different again, and introducing animation, and a really intriguing bit of animation as well. The fact that it was clearly based on kind of public information films. It had a real a very, very heavy vibe of Charlie Says from the 70s and 80s, which at least one of us on this podcast will remember. I'm not going to say which one. Yeah, so from the off, I think it was something we were both looking forward to and excited about.
I wanted to ask if you remembered many of these other sort of public information films and sort of public safety films much from school and stuff like that, because I think there was one we got shown. I don't know if it was like from the 80s. It might have been from the 80s very feasibly, because it was like primary school, and I was, this is like the early mid-90s for me. But I think we watched something about train safety that sort of, like not straying onto the tracks, that kind of thing, that sort of traumatised me, which seemed a bit weird because my primary school wasn't really very near any train tracks, so it was a bit generic, But
yeah,
I remember
and this was up in Manchester as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Which is, remind me, is that where the train was invented? I can't remember, because maybe that's
it's not a conversation I want to have without a lawyer, Preston.
maybe that's why they were showing train films, because obviously you claim to have the very first steam engine in the museum there, don't you?
This is it's like the space race, isn't it? This relitigation of it.
Yes, I do remember them. I remember them quite well, actually. I specifically remember Charlie Says, which younger listeners may know from a hit Prodigy song. Charlie Says was I guess the biggest impact one, I guess, when I was growing up, and there were various different iterations of it. So there were, don't play with matches and don't go near electricity, etc., etc. That's the main animated one I remember. I don't remember many of the rest of them being animated, so I think they've clearly drawn from from Charlie in this one, particularly the way the mouths move, is very reminiscent of that animation.
I think of that as almost like the kind of rhubarb and custard kind of style of limited animation, you know?
Yeah, Crystal Tips as well. I think that kind of similar, you know, discombobulated kind of bits of paper stuck together and clearly being moved around. The other ones I do remember as well. There's I highly recommend the episode that I sent to you. There's an episode of Charlie Brooker's How TV Ruined Your Life that's all about kind of public information films and how TV in the 70s and 80s became kind of an instructional tool, and that's very good, and that goes through a lot of these. One of the ones I remember really vividly is the Green Cross Code Man. The Green Cross Code Man was a very, very tall gentleman in a kind of green and white superhero costume who would basically tell children how to cross the road and always use the Green Cross Code. But of course the most famous thing about the Green Cross Code Man, that he was in fact Darth Vader. So it was Dave Prowse basically who was Darth Vader. And I remember Dave Prowse actually coming to our primary school.
Oh wow!
As the Green Cross Code Man when I was young. And obviously no one gave a shit about the Green Cross Code Man as far as we were concerned. It's just the fact that Darth Vader was in our school, you know, with his West Country accent and everything.
I was going to say he was from the West Country, wasn't he, Dave Prowse?
Yeah, he was from the West Country. I think he's a Bristolian probably. You know, there's that very famous footage of Darth Vader kind of saying, "Where are the rebel plans? We want them alive."
Yeah. Someone should really redo the whole film like that.
Yeah, well, he thought it was actually going to be him. Apparently, he was very. I don't know if this is a myth, but apparently he was very surprised when his voice was recast. Anyway, I'm getting completely off topic now. So I do remember those public information films, and actually that kind of added to my excitement for this of something that, you know, I've said this before, they're a little bit older than me, but our cultural references are pretty similar. I would say. So obviously they've got those things in mind as well. What the public information films that they grew up watching.
You know, it's funny. I was going to say that by my sort of, I guess by the time I was like 10 in the mid-90s, these had kind of petered out as a kind of form, and in a sense they had, but I know for American kids they had those G.I. Joe cartoons which ended with the little sort of morals, you know, and I think even like the He-Man cartoons used to end with like little short like segments at the end that had to talk like moral lessons or safety lessons.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? Yeah. He-Man would always have a little lesson for you at the end.
Yeah. But the thing I was thinking I was kind of exempt from that because I didn't really watch those cartoons when I was a kid. I was just after them and kind of wouldn't have been my thing anyway. But then I remembered that in my youth I had Captain Planet, which was very much about that. You know, it's like, I mean, even the mainstream sort of, you know, plots of those were pro-environmental parables basically and sort of superhero stories, but then they would have those little segments at the end where you'd see someone littering or someone leaving a campfire unattended or something like that, and basically Captain Planet would just turn to the audience and basically say, don't do that, you know, that's a ridiculous thing to do and you'll save the planet if you don't do that, you know. And it's pretty close really. It's just a sort of adaptation of it, you know. And even more of it, you were talking about the Green Cross Code Man, even more of a fusing of that with the superhero thing.
Yeah, I've suddenly just remembered Superman and nicotine as well. Actually, there was a big anti-smoking campaign in the early 80s where they actually used a cartoon, an animated version of Superman. It wasn't the Christopher Reeve version, an animated version of Superman, and his enemy was nicotine, and he had this hat that looked like a cigarette butt, basically. Listeners, didn't work. Yeah, like a fascinating, like sociological history almost. And I do recommend that Charlie Brooker episode because it is a fascinating look at, you know, how in the 80s people kind of went, well, they were realizing that you could use television to sell stuff to people, and then I think, you know, governments and councils and other bodies got involved and went, well, maybe we can use that to, you know, tell people how to cross the road. And I don't know if there were before that, if there was some kind of, you know, mass wave of children being electrocuted by pylons. I don't know if that was actually as big a problem as these information films would seem to make out. And again, I like no coincidence that that's kind of the one they start off with is the kite going up into a pylon, which is very reminiscent of the very famous Jimmy and the Frisbee being thrown into a pylon. Basically, is I think one that everyone who grew up in that era has kind of burned into their brain.
You know, it's funny. It's more sort of straightforwardly authoritarian than sort of like caring or nanny state-ish. But like one I was thinking about that's maybe like the last I encountered anything like this at all was in my kind of later teens, and when I was sort of roughly 20. Do you remember those famously parodied DVD bumpers at the start where it was like, you wouldn't steal an album, or you would steal an album. You wouldn't. Album was a bad example. Yeah.
You've already stolen an album, but you wouldn't steal a car.
Yeah.
You wouldn't steal a handbag.
Yeah.
Piracy is theft.
Because they were basically the same thing, weren't they? They're like, you wouldn't think of it this way, but actually, if you think about it this way, it's a bad thing to do. And they were trading on sort of moral correction, really, weren't they? Like, to try and accomplish whatever the hell those adverts were trying to accomplish, putting the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, they were to an extent, but obviously these ones were public information films in that they were telling children not to climb up pylons or run into the middle of busy traffic. Whereas I think even at a young age, I think we all saw through the facade of, hang on, who benefits from us not stealing, DVDs or not, downloading stuff or recording songs off the radio and C90 cassettes. Everyone growing up in the 80s just had a room full of blank C90 cassettes that just had. It's always been around, that level of kind of, in the most charitable way. It's kind of sharing stuff between you and your friends. And actually, I guess someone has to have bought it in order for you to kind of share it around. Whereas now it can kind of all be sourced. Yeah. Illegally and downloaded for free. Getting vastly off topic now. We're getting into copyright law, which
well, this has just been me. This has just been me wearing a wire trying to get you on tape,
oh, right. I see.
Announcing that you're a thief.
Yeah. This is entrapment, is it? Yeah. You've got me, David. I copied albums onto C90 cassettes, so you've got me banged to rights.
I'm your Javert,
Yeah, I think. Although as we know, not Aha. I purchased those Aha cassettes.
Just in case the lads are listening.
Just in case they are listening. I paid for your. I paid good pocket money for your albums, boys.
I'm sure they'll be very reassured. Which takes us right back to Wise Owl, I guess. Charitably.
Does it?
No. So, I mean, all that preamble aside, talking about public information films and their sort of place in culture and stuff, and I think you're right to point out that the League guys seem to be, I mean, they're not just interested in those as a form, but they're so steeped in that kind of pop culture of the 70s and a mutual fascination for it, and obviously that's carried over to Pemberton and Shearsmith writing these things. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to see that they were clearly riffing on this sort of stuff back when I knew very little about the episode. And I'm really interested to talk to you about this one because I've got mixed thoughts about this one, and I found it very hard. I won't get into the ranking of the overall series because we're going to top out the episode at the end of this by talking about our ranking for the overall of Series 7, what order we put the episodes in respectively, and we'll kind of come up with a joint one. I was really excited about this one, and I think for me, it mostly lives up to the hype. I think that's the really short version. I think it's really effective at channeling a lot of the eeriness and strangeness of those films, and I think it figures out quite a clever way to do that. I do have some minor gripes with it, which we'll get into, but I think generally it worked for me. How about you?
Similar, I think. I've got some points to make. Or statements to make, or even questions to ask about the nature of it. I mean, spoilers. I think right from the off, there's no point dancing around it. I mean, the thing is, so far we've had 2 episodes this season where we've already talked about kind of the spectre of child abuse and how we thought the stories were going to go down that particular road. And they didn't, and I think we both talked about kind of how relieved we were that they weren't going down that particular road with those stories, with Mr. King and with A Random Act of Kindness. And you know what, I got, wherever it is, 23, 24 minutes into this episode where the owl says, "And now you'll come with me," and I just kind of went, "Oh no,
Yeah.
oh no, they've actually gone and done it now, haven't they?
Yeah.
This is we're actually going there."
Those earlier episodes almost look like feints now, don't they? Like I don't know if they were in terms of sequencing or anything, but they maybe it is all just subconscious and kind of what's in the ether. But they almost look like they're deliberately doing that rule of three thing where they kind of hint and then do. It's
it almost does look like they're teeing it up and they're maybe softening the ground. Perhaps I don't know that they are doing that consciously, but perhaps there is an element of let's prepare the ground for this so it is slightly less shocking. We've kind of seeded the idea that potentially something this dark is actually happening, and then it just comes out full out.
Did you listen to the inside number 9 for this episode?
Yeah, I actually have. This is the only one I've listened to for this series, and I think it was for that reason that I was kind of I kind of wanted to hear them talk about it. I kind of wanted to hear if they had a specific rationale or if they had, I hesitate to say justification, but I think it does need justifying. I think it's a very bold thing to do, but I think it's a very I'm not going to say controversial, that's not the right word. I mean, obviously there's an element of controversy to the subject matter. I'm putting it into scare quotes, an entertainment show, a comedy show, and I think that's a bold thing to do that could go either way, that could be handled very well or could be handled very badly.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to hear, but I didn't feel like they really addressed it, to be perfectly honest. I was slightly disappointed that I didn't feel like they had a particularly good rationale for actually using that storyline. It just seemed to be something they used as a bit of a plot point, and I'm not sure how I feel about that.
I'm not sure if I agree with that, but we'll get back to that. It's funny when you said about there's something a bit controversial about this plotline, or and I was talking about things being in the ether and stuff. I think one way in which this might twin quite nicely with Series 6 is that ending with Last Night at the Proms, because I was going to say there's something, whether you think it's effective or not, or even appropriate or not, there's something a bit zeitgeisty about this one, isn't there? There's something in the way that not all the finales, or indeed many of the episodes have been. There's something about this episode that's addressing a feeling of the times, you might say, a bit airily. I think particularly when you get to the end of the episode, the kind of the moment of challenging old repressions and authority, particularly.
But possibly. I mean, can you expand on what you mean of the times? Because I kind of feel like it's slightly outdated as well in a way. I mean, we're also, I don't think it's a huge coincidence that we're dealing with essentially a broadcasting quote unquote celebrity during the 70s. I mean, we're obviously in U-Tree territory here as well. And that's quite a dated idea. I mean, we're going back a good decade since that was really at its the peak of its publicity. So I'm going to push you slightly on what you mean by it kind of being of the time, reflecting the times.
Yeah, I suppose the easiest way to explain that historically is U-Tree and it's the Savile affair and the knock-ons of that and the reverberations of that through British show business particularly led pretty seamlessly into the sort of wider, more internationally pervasive Me Too movement, right? So and I'm including figures like Kevin Spacey in that as well. But I think it's interesting to hone in on the Savile thing, isn't it? Because the figure in Wise Owl who we find was guilty of abuse is a children's entertainer, and is actually or educator / entertainer, and he actually has that bit towards the end when he's talking about having gone to this convention and they talk about nostalgia and how people want to recreate things and it's linked to taxidermy. I'm sort of touching on a lot of things that we could individually talk about here, but he even talks about they have a joke about the other children's TV characters of the 70s, don't they? Like he mentions Rainbow and Bungle. you know.
He mentions Bungle, but not the scary Bungle.
Yeah.
Which again they talk about in the Inside number 9. And I didn't know this. I didn't know there was kind of a pre. I'm glad I didn't know. I didn't know there was a pre-Bungle that's actually slightly more terrifying than the Bungle that I actually grew up with.
A pre-Bungle. I like that phrase.
The Bungle.
The proto-Bungle.
The Bungle. I mean, you could argue that Rainbow was completely fucked up anyway, and what the hell were Zippy and George anyway, and clearly having a slightly scarier Bungle isn't particularly out of character for what that show was. It draws in the idea that that there's a little bit of that. If I'm going to pick holes in this, there's a little bit of that actually doesn't quite work for me, because you're talking about public information films, which were kind of a separate beast to kids' TV shows, and those are the kind of things that I feel like they're muddying that ground ever so slightly for their purposes, which they have every right to do in it, and it kind of works. Particularly when he says, they were going to bring him back, but as a computer animated, and it would have been crap. The thing is about like Charlie and the public information films is that's what they were, and that's all they were, and they later became, the Prodigy sampled the Charlie Says voice, and all the kids went, I remember that from the 80s, and now I can listen to it off my head on ecstasy bread, but it's not the same as when they redid Danger Mouse as a computer animation. It's not the same as when they redid Paddington. It's not the same as when they took proper children's TV shows. And there's something about me that didn't quite buy that the voice of a public information owl was on that convention circuit, along with Bungle and the guy from Pipkin. But maybe like I say, that's probably me just slightly picking holes, because they'd already they had their concept, and their concept was using public information films, which I absolutely thought was great, which I thought was a brilliant idea and brilliantly executed. But then I feel like they had to write around that central conceit and what had happened to him over the last 20 years, and why he'd gone to taxidermy. It was the only bit that didn't quite land for me was the idea of him kind of being bitter about this career he never had, or this career that slightly went awry in the last 20 years, and he had to turn to taxidermy, because they, in my head anyway, as a child, they were always slightly different animals. There was a big difference between I don't know, Colin Baker coming to your local Homeworld to sign photos, and there was never any kind of fandom for that kind of public information stuff, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you said that they sort of tried to play that on you, right? And all you could see was Darth Vader, so it's kind of
yeah, exactly.
Even when you've got a live action figure to glom onto. I think you're really right to point out that there's quite a lot of conflation in this episode, and it's maybe not the neatest of kind of execution of concept in a sense, or execution of several concepts. It's not the neatest tying together of them in a bow. But I think where the episode makes a virtue of some of that muddle, maybe, or just kind of overstuffing, again, the taxidermy thing, is that
very good.
Is that it conflates some of that usefully, in the sense that the father is this public figure and is also a figure of authority and regard for his kids. The early animated scenes, particularly in the episode where they show seemingly quite happy, well-guided kids looking up to him as a source of authority and wisdom, and so even some of the ways that Ronnie Shearsmith's character talks to him in some of the very early scenes, where I mean, from the moment where he actually confronts him in the episode, obviously it's all pretty hostile and pretty standoffish and cautious, and with good reason. But he talks about how he trusted him, and I think there's a conflation there, whether effective or not for the individual viewer, of the trust that people, the perception, whether ever correct or not, that people in the 70s had a trust for public authority that we now lack, I think.
that's a very valid point, well made. I think there's one of the really interesting moments for me is at the end, where we've seen the dad, as the kind of drunken northern dropping the accent, but then at the very end when he's I think Ronnie has already said that he's going to tell, basically, and that he suddenly turns on the wise owl voice and he says, "But we must always do what wise owl says, mustn't we?" And he suddenly turns that on. And actually, there is conflation there, but I bought that. I bought that there would be conflation between the father figure and what the father figure did, and the fact that the father figure was also this voice of authority who we are being asked to believe was a huge kind of cultural phenomenon then and now, and we see that they're getting fan letters. So actually that's seeded quite nicely that, the idea that it was perhaps bigger than, Charlie, for example, or carried a different kind of cultural weight than Charlie. So I think that's quite nice, actually, the idea that, this horrible act being done by this man is a bit of both. It's, he obviously, the main horror of such an act is that it's a huge betrayal of trust. It's the one person who is meant to protect you, and they've completely betrayed you. They've completely betrayed your trust. But actually, it's a double betrayal in this instance, because it's not only is Ronnie being betrayed by his father, he's being betrayed, actively betrayed by this character who has this authoritarian voice that tells children what to do. And again, it's no coincidence that 5-10 minutes before we've had the whole Stranger episode, and I strongly remember all of the Stranger Danger public information films as well, making sure that again, there's a very famous Charlie one where Charlie, this is where the whole "would you like to come and see some puppies" thing comes from. It's literally a stranger comes up to Charlie and says, "Would you like to come with me, and would you like some sweets, or come and see some animals?" And it's no, you mustn't do that. And they were, sadly, they were very necessary in the 80s, as I suspect that. Well, obviously that issue has not entirely and probably never will go away. But the fact that we've dealt with the whole issue of don't go off with strangers, and Wise Owl has given us that information not to go off with strangers. But then we see that the stranger wasn't the only danger that was there. So actually that's quite a sophisticated and that's possibly the most profound bit of the whole narrative, I would say, is the idea that that was the whole narrative that certainly I remember being spun as a child, was you mustn't go with strangers. Well, what if a stranger isn't the issue?
Yes.
And maybe that's where they're quite,
as indeed most abuse isn't, I believe, statistically.
Yeah, that's why I think they're dealing with something in quite a sophisticated way there, but I'm not sure that is true of the episode as a whole.
Well, you know what? I want to get back to that Stranger Danger thing in a sec, because I want to talk a little bit more about the animated segments in a bit more detail. I was just going to add to your point of Ronnie's dad being a horrible person. Obviously, that's a pretty obvious point, but I was just going to add to that and reinforce it and just say that he's not just betrayed his trust, Ronnie's trust, and obviously through neglect led to the death of his sister, but he's continued to betray Ronnie every single day for 20 plus years. For I don't know. I mean, he's meant to be Shearsmith's age now, I guess. So he says his little sister would be 50 now. He's been not helping him. He had a moment of moral neglect and cowardice, you might say, as well as all the abuse, obviously. But then he just didn't tell the truth for decades and decades and decades and decades. He continued to be cruel every single day. Every single day he woke up and was a bad person. Which makes him probably one of the worst characters we've seen on Inside Number 9. Maybe the worst. Maybe right up there. I was thinking with maybe in our EscapeGoat podcast episode, we discussed To Have and To Hold, the one where Pemberton's character has the shall we say secret family in the house.
Yeah,
it's up there with that, isn't it?
Yeah, we're hitting all the cheery ones tonight, aren't we? It's that's up there as well as something kind of unutterably dark.
Yeah.
And very, very difficult to watch, and also very difficult to talk about as well.
Well, I mean, the way I wanted to get into the animated segments was, I think they're really, of the things I think are just uncomplicatedly really good about the episode is the way that those are artfully, gradually used to suggest a blending of memories of genuine public information films that Wise Owl, within Universe actually made, with the memories that Ronnie has and with the returning memories that Ronnie has, particularly towards the end when he sort of seems to make a deliberate effort to have memories returned to him, to really push through the layers of, miasma and everything to really get what happened. But I think on the rewatch, because I rewatched it just earlier today, one of the quite early ones, I think it's At the Beach, is the one about stranger danger, where, as you say, they're playing on those genuine films about that, the risk of that. When you've watched the whole episode and you look back at those ones, there's loads of really nice touches in those, but Wise Owl helps ward off a stranger who's trying to tempt running away, but then Wise Owl kind of he kind of violently pecks at the stranger, and that's a bit startling because it's just a little bit violent for something like that. And then on his way out of the frame, Wise Owl knocks into Ronnie, and I think he says "ow," he kind of, Wise Owl beats a hasty retreat basically, and it's kind of even at that very early stage of the episode, there's something mildly unsettling about this wise mentor figure. Even as he seems to rescue Ronnie's, slightly unsettling things are happening that just throw you on guard a little bit.
I didn't notice that. I have to say, I didn't notice him kind of bumping into Ronnie on the way out of the frame, but I did notice that he's kind of pecking out the stranger. And actually it ends in a really horrible way as well. It ends in a really distressing way with Ronnie just sat there going, "Mummy, mummy, mummy," and no one comes to his rescue. He ends up sat on his own on the beach, crying for his mum. And again, we're adding a layer there, I guess, of memory and the actual reality of what's happened to Ronnie, and how he will have presumably wanted to be helped at some point, but no one heard him or wasn't allowed to hear him. How he was stopped from telling. Just as a slight tangent, that reminded me of one of the most terrifying and disturbing scenes of a film I've seen that keeps coming back to me again and again and again, and it's Under the Skin. It's the Jonathan Glazer film where Scarlett Johansson is, spoilers everyone, basically is an alien who's running around and fucking and killing truckers essentially. Yeah. And there's a scene where there's a family on the beach and they have a dog, and
I know the scene you mean actually. Yeah.
It's where the family go out and the rest of the family drown, and the final shot is just this tiny child sat on the beach on its own crying, and it's like it's miles from anywhere or from anything, and it's just like this 1 minute shot, maybe not even that, of this baby sat on its own, and then it just cuts away. And I just remember coming out of the cinema just going, that's one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen, because your brain just instantly goes to, well, what happens when that camera turns away?
Well, and it's being observed by a creature who has no human empathy as well, or doesn't seem to.
And that scene really reminded me of that you just have this kind of slight lingering shot on Ronnie of him going, "Mummy, mummy," and there is no rescue, and then it just cuts away.
Well, there's another scene a bit like that later in the episode, another animated scene where that you actually see the house on fire, animated house on fire, and you hear the girl screams, and the only person watching it, at least in this short, is the owl.
Is the owl, yeah, and you can see the flames reflected in his eyes, yeah.
They do a really cool, creepy thing with it. I know the animator Inside Unknown talked about his work at length in this, about how he does that style of animation and the choices they made in that, which is really interesting. Just on rewatch, I just noticed that the times that they make the owl's eyes go black at the centre, they play around with that quite a bit, and there's a few moments when it does that, where there's nothing at the. They make it look a bit more relatable by having sort of pupils, and then there's moments when that goes away, and it just makes it all that more eerie. And some of those are moments like the darker moments in the narrative, like where it's beckoning Ronnie upstairs and things like that. Which I guess you could read a bunch of stuff into, whether it's meant to signify a sort of smothering of empathy within the father or something like that. I don't know, but it's one thing I was going to say was this is another one where it's interesting to keep an eye on timings and stuff. I didn't note everything down, but I did note one down, which is at about 11 minutes in, is when you get, I guess you're already establishing the sort of surface narrative of, Ronnie appears to be a sort of troubled, guilt-ridden fire starter, essentially. Like that seems to be the story that we're going for, which, if you watch Number 9, it's probably not the whole story, but that's it. But I think it's about 11 minutes in when you get the owl coming into the hospital ward and just going, you mustn't tell anyone. And that was the moment when I was just like, you were talking about later in the episode when you've got the beckoning up the stairs moment, but that was the moment when I was just like, oh, God, help. Like, without knowing the specifics, I was just like, this is not going to any good place,
Yeah, it's around there. I think it's slightly later than that. I think it's about halfway through, and the reason is because I was very curious about the timings as well, and I noted in the rewatch, so it's almost at 10 minutes. It's just slightly shy of 10 minutes when he takes the call from his mother on his mobile phone, and that's actually crucial because up until that point, everything suggests that we are actually in the 70s. All of the decor, all of the costume, to the extent of the radio that he's going to throw into the bath to kill himself, everything suggests to us that we are in fact in the 70s and that this is taking place in a different period, and it's literally not until 10 minutes in. I mean, even to the extent that the Steve Pemberton character is kind of ambiguously dressed in terms of what era Steve Pemberton's character comes from, is very deliberately dressed as if they could be from the, he's got a mullet, for God's sake. It's, he's either a very unfashionable person, but at that point we're just led to believe we're in the 70s. But then at 10 minutes, or just under 10 minutes, he takes a very, very obtrusively, he is, FaceTiming with his mum, and you kind of go, oh, we're not at all where I thought we were. And that is a really neat trick, because you're imagining that we are in the 70s, and these public information films up to that point are contemporary. And that's what that's the conclusion I think we're being asked to draw. And then that's the first of the rug pulls where it kind of goes, well, no, hang on, these are not necessarily contemporary artifacts, and you now need to be aware that there may be an unreliable narrator, or there may be other things that are going on, and that everything might not be as it appears. I mean, that's seeded slightly from the beginning, where he comes back to the bath and there's a feather in there, and already you're kind of thinking, well, hang on. Oh, and actually you get the owl's voice over the radio to begin with, don't you? Yeah. So there's a magic realism that's already sneaking its way in. That's again, it's inside Number 9, so you kind of ain't no big deal where you kind of think, oh, all is not as it appears. I wonder what's happening. You're kind of constantly waiting for them to sort of explain what it is they're doing this time round, I guess.
But you're right, though. There is a temporal dislocation and discombobulation, which kind of, I suppose, amongst other things, sort of mirrors the idea that Ronnie has never mentally left the 70s in a way, isn't it? Like, because he's so damaged, because he's so traumatized and betrayed and, well, incarcerated, essentially, and everything. He just hasn't grown up, and his styling, of course, as well reflects that, doesn't it? His haircut, his clothes to an extent.
Yeah, on again another tangent. I know I said in a previous episode I really wanted to do a kind of wig graph, which sadly I haven't got around to yet. But it really reminded me of the Macbeth wig from The Understudy.
Right, actually,
it's really, really similar. Reece Shearsmith looks really similar in that wig to The Understudy.
Can I get one of my negatives out? Because actually there's a load more positive I want to say about the episode, but I think one of my biggest negatives for this, I almost felt a bit guilty mentioning this. Not that I should, because there's nothing personal about whether it works for you or not. But so I think it was Simon Says we were talking about last series, where I mean that ended up being my least favourite last series for a number of reasons. But and I'm not saying it was terrible or anything. It's just it just was my least favourite. And I remember voicing in that one that it was one where I thought it would have been better for an actor other than Reece Shearsmith to play the younger fan character who challenges Pemberton's creation. This is another one where, and I've not been able to dispel it. I've seen Wise Owl now about 4 times. I think I've really given it a few goes, and it's weird. It's actually gone up and down in my estimations each time. I think it's kept penduluming a bit. I think though consistently I'm of the conclusion that I not sure if Reece Shearsmith should have played this character, because it's to do with the style. It's to do with things that are good for them to do, but in Reece Shearsmith add up to something that I don't think works, because it's again, you know, I think in this series I've talked about the legacy, the long shadow of the League of Gentlemen, and of the sort of, you know, broader character comedy they did in the League and things like that. And I just think if you have a sort of stunted man-child eccentric who is styled in a slightly silly way with slightly silly clothes and a silly haircut, and it's played by Shearsmith, I think, and it's things like he's doing a northern accent, and loads of the League of Gentlemen characters were northern accented and things like that, you know, and it's just, I was thinking if this was played by just a sort of relatively anonymous or up and coming character actor, I think it would be, you know, with maybe Shearsmith could show up, you know, in the cartoons as one of the voices or something like that, you know, and or, you know, he could have a cameo as the postman at one point or something like that, you know. I think this is maybe, in my opinion, a role that should have gone to someone else, because I think there is just something irreducibly a bit silly in an episode that needs to be, certainly at points, extremely serious about Shearsmith in that get-up, you know?
Yeah, I do. I don't think I had a problem with that as much as you've just expressed it, and I think that's perfectly valid. And again, as we've discussed before, I'm not bringing that much League of Gentlemen baggage with me. Perhaps not as much of League of Gentlemen baggage as you are. So I wonder if that's just partly that. I mean, I bought the fact that I think Shearsmith was fine to be cast as this character, and I think they were treading that line anyway between, you know, comedy and tragedy, because, you know, the whole rabbit sequence,
Ferrari,
and you know, and all of Pemberton's bit is you know, the comic relief. It's let's get some gags in, because for God's sake, we are still making a comedy show, and this is where we can get our laughs. So I felt more like the Shearsmith character when he appears was more just weird and strange, and again with all the knowledge that we bring from watching all the previous episodes of Inside Number 9. You know, you're kind of like, okay, he's dressed a certain way, he's got a certain wig on, he's doing a certain voice. I mean, I guess I don't know. Maybe I just suspend my disbelief a bit more with them, because I kind of never really know where they're going to go and what they're going to serve up to me. So I just let them get away with it.
Oh, it's definitely your mileage may vary stuff. Definitely. I mean, I think there's I think actually where, you know, where it's more effective, where it's channeling, you know, horror movies, because, you know, there's a bit of Norman Bates in it. There's the idea of, you know, because obviously for quite a lot of the episode we don't know what's happened to his dad, and, you know, like why he's, as it becomes more and more apparent it's his dad's house, where is his dad, what's happened, you know, like the idea of the sort of stunted child living in the shadow of the parent and actually in the house. I mean, the taxidermy definitely evokes Psycho, right? I mean, that's something that's in there in a big way, and I think all those echoes are of Gothic horror, and the problem is the League traded so heavily in Gothic horror, and Shearsmith is so indelibly associated with that it's just a bit too much for me. But it's funny you talk about the comic relief bits, right? Because, you know, the Ferrari, the rabbit, and the awful state he makes of that and everything, they're definitely grimly funny. But there's also the bit, I mean, even in the grimness, there's a little oasis of humour in the taxidermy scene, isn't there, in Wise Owl, where he's actually teaching his kids how to do taxidermy.
Oh, that's brilliant. That was my favourite bit.
Yeah.
That was my favourite bit of the entire episode. I thought that was genius. That's a stroke of genius to set up this idea of a public information film. And at the point where we still don't really know what's going on. We know he's being asked to do taxidermy. And at that point, no, we still don't know that he's not his dad. We still don't know at that point, because then Pemberton comes back and says, "Oh, the neighbours just told me that actually he's a man in his 70s, and you're clearly not that." So we don't really know what's going on at that stage. So then this very detailed explanation of how to, you know, and then you must remove the pelt. And
dispose of the carcass in the furnace.
And dispose of the carcass, and always read the label. Now it's time to play a game or have a sandwich. I thought that was brilliant. That was absolutely fantastic. Love that scene.
Well, the implication there is that Ronnie's, because Ronnie's as a character at that point is trying to think how to do taxidermy, isn't there? So I suppose the implication is that he's calling on his actual memories of his dad telling him and presumably his sister how to do that as a kid, and making it into a public information film in his head, because the two things are so warped together, you know.
Possibly there's a bit that doesn't quite tie up there, because his dad then kind of, when he comes back and says, oh, you know, I don't suppose you followed my career over the last 20 years, I don't suppose they really told you anything where you were. And let's not forget that Ronnie's been institutionalized for a long period. I think that's it's alluded to, but it's never really faced head on, the fact that Ronnie's been in an institution, although they do mention his doctor as well, don't they? But I think the fact is that his dad then says, so I ended up doing this, like that's information Ronnie doesn't have, like the taxidermy thing is completely new to him. So I don't know that he's drawing on memory, he's utterly inventing something.
See, I assume that was a hobby turned career, if you see what I mean. Like that was something his dad used to do for fun or something, and that he's now to fall back on, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. That is also plausible. And you have the mum setting up Mimsy the cat quite early on as well, and then it comes back to Mimsy the cat, and it suggests that, you know, Mimsy the cat was the first bit of taxidermy. So maybe that is the case. I think there's a couple of interpretations there, and I think particularly as with a random act of kindness, I don't think it really matters. I don't think it's relevant. I don't know that they may have an answer, but if it's a different one to everyone else, then I don't think it really is pertinent.
There's a few more bits, firstly in that sequence, but a few more bits I want to draw your attention to or get your thoughts on. The first two are in that taxidermy sequence. One's amusing, one's potentially horrific. The amusing one is, I just loved when the Wise Owl says taxidermy, and the daughter goes, taxi what? And he just goes, dermy. That just really made me laugh. Just straightforwardly, that was great. But the potentially horrific one, which I only caught on about the third viewing, was he refers to the process of getting the animal pelt back on the sort of wireframe as I think he says something. Ronnie says something like rolling a sausage back inside its skin, and the Wise Owl's like, exactly, you know, or something like that. And it's just like, I'm like, you know, when you know where it's going, like that's there's some things in there, I think, you know. On the more sort of explicit horror stuff, I wanted to ask, because they seem to be quite impressed with going for it and achieving it in the Inside Number 9 podcast. What did you think of the bit where Ronnie sees the owl, like the owl man in his house?
I've got one major comment about that, and it's kind of a strange one, and it's a link in that, and I didn't spot this the first time, but I've just rewatched it. And I know that they say in the podcast, oh, you know, you hang back and that makes it more terrifying. And you could see that there's this weird kind of papier-mâché head, and then it spins around in a really unrealistic way. Yeah. So you kind of know that this is some kind of dream sequence or something along those lines. And you can see a naked torso, but actually it's completely naked. I'm pretty sure it does hang back, but the owl is actually naked, and you can see the outline of penis. Yeah.
You can definitely see his genitals. Yeah.
Now, the reason this is an interesting factoid is that this is also directed by Louise Hooper, who directed Mr. King. Mr. King is the other episode where you genuinely see penises. You see the Polaroids that have been taken. You see images of flaccid penises in that episode. And in the same way, like, suddenly we've got two actual penis shots in episodes of Inside Number 9, and,
which is still unusual enough on television to comment on, isn't it? Like,
which is unusual enough to comment on, but also it could be pure coincidence. But they're the same director as well. I don't know. Make of that what you will. I'm not drawing any conclusions from that, but I just noticed that it was the same director as Mr. King, and kind of thought, but they both had knob shots in them, which is, like you say,
long may that phrase reign.
Knob shots, you know. I believe that's an industry term.
Yeah, that's actually technical. Yeah. Your industry days coming back. I'm actually glad you mentioned the director, because there's that thing. I don't normally, try and go through what they say on that podcast and catalogue it, because that's for that show. But like, that thing she mentioned where they'd snuck a Welsh language Wise Owl poster into the Mr. King classroom.
Oh, I missed that entirely. I must have fallen asleep during that bit of the podcast, because I usually listen to my podcasts at bedtime, which is why I've never heard an entire episode that we've done, David. Did they really? So there's a Welsh language Wise Owl poster in Mr. King.
So there are at least 2 Inside Number 9 episodes that do, by implication, exist in the same universe now.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, does that mean that, well, which way round had they been done then? Presumably they'd already got, the shooting schedule done, so they knew that she was going to direct both of those. So actually it doesn't matter which way round they shot them.
I think they may have said they were overlapping a bit. I think Reece Shearsmith talks in that podcast about having to film that weird bit where he's kind of inserted, into the animation.
Yes, I was awake for that bit, where he then just suddenly had to go and take the wig off and do green screen. So yes, obviously they were I suspect they were shooting a block with the same director. That's very interesting. What is Wise Owl in Welsh? Do we know?
Oh no, I didn't. I should look that up, but it's probably it's probably just as disturbing. That'd be a really obscure Inside Number 9 fan thing, wouldn't it, to have the Wise Owl poster in Welsh on your wall or something?
I mean, an obscure thing, but also a very weird thing.
Deeply disturbing, yeah.
Deeply disturbing thing.
Well, let me ask you about the ending then, because there was one thing that just in the lead up to the ending that I wanted to comment on, which is another sort of horror-y type thing, which is when Ronnie is leading his father up the stairs at knife point, basically, and he sees the little sister standing over a cake, seemingly sort of in flashback. There's a really nice thing they do with that I only caught literally on today's viewing, where as the sister sort of looks up at him and then she turns back away, they sort of blur her head, so it kind of... She turns away, but so her face is kind of overladen with her hair, so her head seems to be in flux, basically. So it's not as cheesy as like having her fade away like a conventional ghost. It's just she looks like a kind of blur. It's a really weird, very low key weird thing to do.
So is she being written by? She's being written by Geraldine Clarkson. Geraldine Clarkson is that her name? She's being written by the author in Nine Lives Cat.
Well, yeah, that I was trying to imply that, but yeah, that's maybe that's what's happening. They're all linked. No, I mean, what do you make of it? Because we kind of got into this a little bit near the start, didn't we? Where we were talking about the zeitgeistiness of the episode, or what they're trying to convey here, and why they go for the ending they do. I mean, it does appear from as that scene intensifies, doesn't it, that we are going to end up with a kind of more conventionally, you might say, murderous episode, like a kind of maybe like Justified Wrath, but angry, violent retribution episode, and that's not what we end up with. What do you make of that?
Yeah, again, it's and this is why I don't often listen to the Inside Number 9 podcast. Is they talked very specifically about how they wanted a more redemptive ending. They didn't want a kind of revenge ending. They didn't want him to stab his dad and leave him in a pool of blood and feathers, which they obviously could easily have done. That's a very nice moment, by the way. It's a very nice touch, all the down coming out of the feathers and kind of being scattered over the dad as he's leaving. I don't know, because I've still got qualms about the content as a whole. Not, I don't think I'm particularly squeamish, but this one does trouble me slightly, and I feel like maybe that's a bit of a let's have our cake and eat it, or let's we can't possibly we're dealing with a subject here that's very difficult, and in order for us to, again, quote unquote, get away with it, we have to have a redemptive ending. We can't, it has to be obviously there's no happy ending in this scenario, but it has to be an ending whereby justice is served in a conventional and moral way, whereas as Ronnie killing his dad would perhaps be very satisfying in a kind of revenge tragedy kind of way, but I think would leave us as horrified that not only has this the child has suffered horrific abuse, and the psychological damage is untold. But if he then becomes a murderer, like we're then into something else entirely.
Well, it would destroy what's left of Ronnie's life, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like it had to be a redemptive ending for them to in any way get away with telling this story, which. I love you guys, but slightly begs the question: should you have told it?
Well, this is where I get back to the Me Too thing, I think, because there's something in the culture at the moment that's, obviously we've always tried to have an idea through our fiction and through our news reporting, etc., of ideas of justice, however flimsy or, pragmatically bogged down and all that. But, justice has never been a simple thing. But I think there's something in the culture at the moment, particularly maybe in the progressive culture, that's trying to right the wrongs of, earlier decades, and that a big part of justice now is not so much retribution as bringing things out into the open, as kind of there's a phrase I'm looking for here, the kind of attached to things like the South Africa reconciliation hearings, that kind of thing, where the main thing is to get these things out of the darkness, and I think that it's interesting that Ronnie's punishment is not, again, taxidermy analogy, an eye for an eye kind of thing. It's just, this needs to not be a secret anymore. I can't be carrying this around anymore. People need to know about this. I need to tell my mum this, even though that's my mum's been traumatized, but this will be also hugely upset her. They don't really get into that, but that's better than this still festering in the dark,
That's a very fair point. I don't think I'd viewed it in those terms. I think that makes me more sympathetic to the ending, actually, in terms of it being the justice being about bringing it out into the light and making it known. I'm happier with that as an interpretation, I guess.
I really liked it being a kind of, again, it's hugely grim and tragic, but this sort of redemptive end to the series as a whole, to this series, and I liked the music. I thought the music was gorgeous at that point. That sort of uplifting strings music on rewatch occurs earlier in the episode as well, but at the ending, it's just, I found it very moving, the way the owl's chasing after him and sort of losing feathers as it goes, and just kind of there's something a bit sort of supernatural about it, isn't there? Like the kind of this creature losing its power because you've turned your back on it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to skip straight ahead and ask you about the final line as well, and whether you thought the final line of "Get Stuffed" worked or not, or whether we're back in "I'm all ears" territory.
Well, yeah, it's just, it's just occurred to me that it's sort of doing again what we found really annoying in Kidnap. Yeah, I think it's probably the most flippant way you can end it. I mean, I suppose it's coming back to that comedy drama thing, isn't it? Like, it's appropriate to end with a punchline, I guess, and it's a very simple but quite clever punchline, and it chimes with the catharsis, like you're telling someone that you've had enough, I liked it, I think, as part of that climax, I think. Well, I mean, I think I've said all I need to say about that, I think, but as I say, like every rewatch I did of this, it kind of, the things that I don't think work as effectively about it weighed on me, and I found new things to like in it, and it kept going back and forth. After a short break in a second, we'll get into our whole series rankings, but I think this one I wouldn't spoil it, but I found quite hard to place, and it did vary a little bit. But I mean, do you have any final thoughts about Wise Owl?
Yeah, well, I have two final thoughts about Wise Owl, and we haven't really talked about the cast yet. So it's a very, very small part for Georgie Glenn, who plays the mum, who I and possibly lots of other people will know mainly as the agony aunt who turns up on Alan Partridge's Norfolk digital show, and she's wonderful in that. And actually, I think she comes back in this time, doesn't she? Where she comes back as the agony aunt. So that's kind of instantly recognised her from that, and she's got a very small part, but she does a huge amount with it. She's she plays that absolutely beautifully. She's got a lovely little joke about, it's only 8:15. Why is he going to bed? She's calling him in between corries,
That's something my mum has genuinely said to me in my life.
It's a lovely little gal. I think my mum has as well, actually. That's a lovely little gal, and she's just very human. She's just very humane in that scene, and in many ways that that having that grounding element, even if it's just for those couple of minutes. Really, grounds it and redeems it in a certain way. So the other thing, obviously, I wanted to say was about Ron Cook, which is, it's a horrible, horrible character, but obviously a great performance because it's, I don't think it's a judgmental performance. There's this old adage that the only way you can, as an actor, you can play a monster is you can't believe they're a monster. You have to play them as if you believe you are in their head. It's otherwise how could you play Hitler? How can you play Richard III? How can how can you play any monsters?
Well, the way he talks to Ronnie, it's like these horrible manipulative lies, essentially, that he repeats to Ronnie and has been repeating to him for decades. He believes them on some level, doesn't he?
Yeah,
he believes everything. He believes everything from it sort of being Ronnie's fault to the fact that he loved the kids to the fact that Ronnie enjoyed their games in the bedroom. He kind of believes all that, you think?
I think that's exactly what comes across in the performance and the nuance of it. And again, that's a very troubling thing to watch is the idea that he believes, it's that line where I think you're remembering it wrong, Ronnie, and it's shot through with enough meaning and intent behind it that it does kind of stop you in your tracks for a moment and go, okay, well, hang on, like what's real now? What's real in it, and it makes you have to question that. So the final thing I wanted to say about Ron Cook is pop quiz, David. Which Blackadder character does he play?
Oh God. I meant to look up his IMDb before I came on to do this as well, and I didn't.
Well, I did.
Go on then.
It's series 1 of Blackadder, and he is Sean the Irish Bastard.
Wow. That's a deep EscapeGoat friendly cut. That's
absolutely.
Oh, very good. Yeah, I suspected he may have been in some stuff back in the 70s that they worshipped. Given his age,
It's kind of fascinating, actually. I love actors like this, where you look them up on IMDb, and it's just the very definition of a jobbing actor in the 70s and 80s, and to an extent. I'm in danger of getting on a bit of a soapbox here. To an extent, what the industry used to be like, how it used to be about repertory theatre, and it used to be how you could earn a very decent living just doing bit parts in TV, and maybe you'd get a recurring role, and you'd just keep going, and then you'd do some rep, and you do some touring theatre. The kind of thing that doesn't really exist anymore because the repertory theatres are all gone, and budgets have become so much bigger that everything is kind of star led, and the industry has just changed a lot. That the kind of people, the kind of actors like this, the kind of careers like this don't really happen this way anymore. And it's you notice that way when you go through someone like Ron Cook's IMDb that starts in 1975 with something called Ballet Shoes, with like a TV miniseries, and then he's doing lots of Shakespeare, and he's doing lots of BBC TV Shakespeare, and then Blackadder. He's in The Young Ones as well.
Oh wow, I'll have to look that one up.
He's prisoner on ship in The Young Ones.
Oh, I actually know what episode that is. That's crazy.
And then he goes, and then he's in The Singing Detective. He's in Bergerac. He's in Boone. he's
pretty sure Boone, obligatory Boone mention.
Yeah, obligatory Boone mention.
That's your Star Trek in terms of this podcast, isn't it?
Boone is not my Star Trek. How very dare you?
That's your T-shirt I'm getting you. Boone is not my Star Trek.
Boone is not. That's an awful thing to say. Or maybe it is. And we bring back Neil Morrissey. Anyway, and then he's in some Hornblowers. Anyway, people can look this up themselves.
Just while we're singing his praises, I just wanted to, because you were talking about what a great performance it is. It's also obviously a great performance as Wise Owl in the animated segment.
Yes.
I know that's treated, sonically and everything. They make that sound more like you know, he's doing a slightly different accent, and but they make it sound like more like one of those clips from the 70s. But it's a great nuanced thing, isn't it? Especially when we didn't really talk about this clip, but you know, the clip when he's shown to be, it is the one where Ronnie's in the live action insert, and you know, he's shown to be helplessly drunk in the corner just before the sisters burn to death, you know, and he's doing the Wise Owl voice, but bits of the real life dad are coming through, and it's slurring and all that, you know, and that's quite the thing to pull off, isn't it?
Yeah, he does drunkenness very well. Again, notoriously, it's, you know, playing drunk is very hard to do realistically, because you go too far usually into absurdity, and he plays drunk very well. So, you know, kudos. I mean, again, I think they do talk about how obviously they wanted to work with him, and they have a lot of respect for him. And I think obviously that does speak to a sense of them understanding the importance of getting this right and getting, you know, and doing it well. And, you know, imagine if you'd fucked this episode up, it would be, you know, a absolute disaster. It could be a complete car crash if this is not done properly. And I guess that's probably what I'd finish with saying, despite all of the reservations I brought up. I think those performers and that director, I think they do something that gives me pause and that I have reservations over and questions, which I'm happy to be challenged and questioned in the things that I watch, particularly by these boys. But I think by and large, they're all very talented people, and you certainly don't come away going that was a shit show that should never have been aired.
Yeah. Which I think was more akin to your opinion of Last Night at the Proms, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was, and I keep meaning to go back and rewatch that, but I
don't think you said it should never have been aired. I think you just, you know, you were less keen on it. It didn't work.
No, I don't think I'm. Very few things that I think shouldn't be aired. But yeah, I wasn't a fan at all.
Yeah. I mentioned that because I think in this, we'll take a little break now, but then in the final segment we're going to talk about our rankings for Series 7 as a whole, now that we've covered the whole thing, and I think we'll probably maybe touch briefly on Series 6 as well, just to kind of weigh it up in our memories, and obviously what we said last year against this current series. So join us after the break. Okay, so the moment of truth. As we did last year when we talked about Series 6, we came to the end of that and we tried to rank them. So we did separate rankings, me and John, and then I think I hastily worked out a little point system which sort of, you know, gave you our joint favourite, if you like, which I'll try and do on the spot today as well. But yeah, so these are going to be John's opinions and mine, but we'll run through them sort of side by side. So of the 6 episodes that have aired this year in Series 7, John, I think the way we did it last time is we went through our mutual bottom three, our respective bottom threes, and then we got into the sort of top threes after that. So let's do that. So I'm wanting to hear your number 6, then your number 5, and then your number 4.
Should we just say our number 6 together?
Yeah, that's. I don't think that's going to be a problem.
3, 2, 1. Kidnap.
I would have been really surprised. I'm not being mean about it, but I would have been really surprised if it had been different. Just given the chat we had about it, and you know, it's clear, just mediocrity, I suppose. You know.
Yeah, again, the caveat here is that this is inside number 9, so it's better than a lot of stuff on TV anyway. So you know, a subpar episode of inside number 9 is potentially knocks most things into a cocked hat anyway. But nonetheless, yes, I think we were in agreement when we talked about this that it was the least successful one for both of us.
Yeah.
So my number 5. So I've gone with 9 Lives Cat.
Okay, interesting.
And my number 4, and I'm still not entirely sure about this, but I'm just going to say what I wrote down earlier. I'm actually going with A Random Act of Kindness.
Well, so I can tell you, I've already said my number 6 is Kidnap. My number 5 is also 9 Lives Cat. And I can say that my number 4 is also Random Act of Kindness.
Wow, okay.
We've actually lined up exactly. And I should remind listeners that, for anyone who cares, that in Series 6 we actually... Our least favourite episode... My least favourite episode was your favourite episode of the series. So this does not always happen. I wondered if we were going to be more in sync this series. I sort of sensed we might be, but in some respects. But it's interesting that they exactly line up those bottom 3. Could you... Because I actually... It's funny, when I was having a little piece of paper that I was shuffling around several times to kind of work these out. And these were relatively... I'd say that the bottom 2, Kidnap and 9 Lives Cat, I was pretty solid on being the least of them. But I'd say, again, grading on an inside number 9 scale, I think I thought of Kidnap as kind of what you might call a D, and then 9 Lives Cat was like an interesting C, I guess you'd say. Was that sort of similar with you, or I just want to know about your kind of...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Kidnap just was flawed in too many ways and wasn't satisfying enough. 9 Lives Cat, again, I think was really interesting and had a particularly great performance from Sophie Okonedo in it. I think, interestingly, the thing from our conversation that stuck with me was the idea of whether they pushed it one step too far rather than sticking with the idea that they had, and that extra kind of Inception-esque remove was possibly pushed it too far for me and made it slightly less satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's how I feel about it too. I think, well, I mean, why would you put A Random Act of Kindness above those two, I suppose?
Jessica Hines. She wasn't a reason other than that. No, I think there's far more nuance, and there is a very interesting, very human performance in there, and a bit more mystery than those other two have got. There is a lot of there are a lot of questions all the way through the episode, and some quite big ideas and some shocks. I haven't been back to rewatch this one yet. This is the only one that I've seen once, so I wonder if it would change position were I to give it another rewatch. I
think it could go either way with that one, because there's a lot to, as we discussed when we talked about it, there's a lot to enjoy on the rewatch with Pemberton's performance especially, but there's also some of the plot implications and problems that we talked about as well that maybe make it more of a problem, so it could go either way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've got a phrase ringing in my ears from a friend of mine who messaged me to say that it had pantomime levels of science fiction in it, which I can't get that phrase out of my head now. And now I think about the ending and them kind of stood in the kitchen in silly wigs. It is a slightly pantomime level of science fiction.
It was some of that, actually. I've just realised actually that obviously something that wouldn't have occurred to us before seeing Wise Owl, that Shearsmith's character in that is engaged in sort of educational films as well, isn't he?
He is, yeah. That's a good spot.
Weird little parallel there. I think it maybe some of the pantomime sci-fi, maybe not partly the trappings, but also the some of the you have to kind of squint and maybe it works and maybe it makes sense stuff. I think maybe the sci-fi nerd inside me was like a bit they did a bit much of that for me to really let them get away with it. I think would be the way to say it. I think it's an episode where I think if they'd left it even more vague, it might have worked better in some ways. If you, the audience, had been privy to a bit less of what was going on with the mechanics and what was happening in the future and stuff, I think that might actually have worked better for me, and that might have been enough to edge up to third. But yeah, that's where it fell. Well, I'd like to ask you then what your number 3 is, and I'll when you've said it, I'll tell you whether mine's the same or not, and we'll proceed from there.
Twit you.
Right. So Wise Owl is your
yes,
number 3.
I've got
mine. Is mine. That's not my number. That's not my number 3. So I'll let you talk about Wise Owl. So Wise Owl. I mean, obviously we've just been talking about that now. So I mean, I guess we've already talked a bit about the mixture of the successful and the unsuccessful in that for you. But I mean, not that there's anything wrong with 3, but I mean that's where you've decided to put it eventually, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's there. It's there for execution, and it's there for the inventiveness, particularly of the animation. And it's not going to get higher than that for me, I don't think, because of my, I don't know, maybe it's my squeamishness, I don't know.
Well, I'll just say that my number 3 is, how should we do this? No, I'll say that I put Wise Owl at number 2.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the way I'll do it. So I'll fill that in there because we've just talked about that. So my number 3, I suppose your answer to this will make it apparent what our number 1s are, I suppose. My number 3 is Merrily Merrily.
Ooh. So Merrily Merrily is my number 1.
Okay, right, yes. I thought this might happen.
And Mr. King is my number 2.
Right, so this is interesting. So obviously Mr. King by implication is my number 1. So that means,
ladies and gentlemen, listeners, right now watching David on this Zoom call is like watching Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind. I can just see him grasping numbers out of the air and sliding them around and dealing with the permutations.
Exactly what's happening. So that's really interesting. So we've got, obviously our bottom 3 here line up altogether, and our top 3s have interesting variation. Merrily Merrily was tough. So if you look at my 2, 3, and 4, so this is Wise Owl, Merrily Merrily, and A Random Act of Kindness, I'd say those were all B episodes for me. They're all different variations, and I literally went back and forth between like having B pluses, Bs, B minus, like that, and they actually all shifted in those positions as well. I don't think any of them escaped that being basically B episodes, but for me, I kept weighing up the pros and cons of each of them and being like, well, none of them do the whole thing for me really, but they're all in that zone. Whereas for me, Mr. King, like I was thinking about this in terms of Series 6 as well, I think Mr. King's a real A episode for me. And I wouldn't say I know these distinctions are slightly ridiculous, but my favourite episodes of Inside Number 9, some of the ones we talked about on our initial EscapeGoat podcast, for example, things like The Ghost of Christmas, the Devil of Christmas, Empty Orchestra, things like that, they are real A pluses. I don't think this is quite an A plus, but it's up there with the best of Inside Number 9 in my book. Certainly just below that ceiling. But I think on that second episode when we talk about Mr. King, you were leaning slightly more towards Merrily Merrily, maybe just in terms of your personal preferences, and it's interesting to see that stuck.
Yeah, I think it has stuck, and I really liked Mr. King, and it's there's not much more than a Rizzler paper between them, to be honest, and I enjoyed them for different ways, and I think when you asked me, I kind of said they're just different. I don't know if I can judge them because they're just different, but I guess I can, and I have judged them. So there we go. I'm a liar. Yeah, I think Merrily Merrily does, for me, it does what maybe I have obviously I have a slightly different criteria of the episodes that really connect with me are the ones that, have a good amount of laughs in them, but also have, a really strong emotional punch in that one, I think. And a rug pull that is not particularly, I was going to say not particularly supernatural, because I don't consider the ending to be the rug pull. I consider the rug pull to be, that his wife is dead and everything that ensues from that, and that, that being the emotional heart of it. And I think, I don't know, that connected with me, and the idea of, three old friends who were, going back to university and had different memories. Funnily enough, a friend of mine went back to a friend I went to university with went back with a couple of her friends, and hasn't seen this episode of Inside Number 9, doesn't get on with Inside Number 9 particularly well, but came back and said, yeah, it was a really weird experience because we were walking around the town and we all kind of we pieced together our collective experience with one person saying, oh, do you remember when we were here and we did that? And the other person going, no, not really, but do you remember when we were here and we did that? No, not really, but do you... And like they literally did that thing where they kind of pieced together their collective experience. And I think maybe that's it for me as well. There's something that strikes very, very true about that experience that has, I guess that's going to connect with me emotionally more than a very, very good Wicker Man pastiche, which is, which I love Mr. King for being, but it doesn't have the emotional hold on me that Merrily Merrily does. And I think for me, Merrily Merrily is probably up there with, one of my favourite all-time episodes, I suspect. Time will tell, but my instinct is that it probably is.
Well, just to speak briefly to my side of the tree then, I obviously put Merrily Merrily at number 3, and it's really solid. I really enjoyed it. I've rewatched it. It's really fun. The performances are fun, and as you say, it's very emotionally resonant about that kind of uni friends, hinterland kind of stuff. It's very, very sad about, grief and loss and all that, and obviously it's entertaining and lovely to see Gatiss back together with them. I think Wise Owl was always going to be in the top 3 almost, and I think it could have gone a bit worse for Wise Owl in my estimation, and it still probably would have been top 3, probably not second, but as I did put it, but just because I love to see them punch for those things that they haven't done before. In the moment the animation conceit came in, I was just like, well, this is really going to have to be terrible to not impress me, essentially, and it wasn't terrible, so that's why it's 2. But it's funny you talk about the Wicker Man pastiche thing, because here's me previously complaining about them going back to too many wells of the League of Gentlemen in terms of styling and reference and things like that, and yet here's me putting Mr. King at number 1 for this series. I think that obviously people can go back and listen to the episode where we talked about it, but I think it is those resonances for me of the politics in it, of the stuff I talked about, of the environmentalism, of the interesting kind of, again, maybe zeitgeisty kind of echoes, the Greta Thunberg stuff, the ritual stuff, the countryside versus urban stuff that I always find fascinating. And it is kind of all stuff that's in the Wicker Man, but it's stuff that they're putting a successful modern twist on. It's funny, it's genuinely spooky. I think just in terms of some of the imagery at the end there, with the costumes and the ritual, and the music, it just really stuck with me. And I think there's the sort of sentimental thing that I got to watch it with my brother as well, which was really fun, and then we kind of both got to experience it side by side along together, which I think is a fun way to watch it, actually, because you and I haven't managed to actually get together and watch any of these side by side on the sofa for this series, have we? Which actually might be quite a fun thing to, if we do this next year, might be quite a fun thing to try and do, because I think that helps.
Yeah, you know what? I had a quandary because I was away over the bank holiday weekend, and I didn't see Wise Owl the night before, and then I was away. And when I was away, I was like my friend, I don't know, it was one of my friends who doesn't really get on with Inside Number 9, but 2 friends, and I don't know whether they've really been keeping up with Inside Number 9. But it's like you can watch them in any order, and I wonder, will I get us all to sit down and watch Wise Owl? And I'll actually, I don't think I've watched an episode with someone ever. Actually, I think I've watched them all on my own. And I deliberated over it, and I kind of went, I don't know that I want to. I don't know that I want to watch this. I don't know that I want the weight of worrying what other people think about it while I'm watching it. So I kind of shied away from that, and I waited till I got home to watch it. Which is not to say that I wouldn't sit and watch one with you, David, obviously, because I think we both know where we stand in terms of whether we like Inside Number 9 or not. I think
I'm on the fence, but yeah,
I think that particular Pandora's jar has already been opened.
Well, I told you on our episode about our favourites pre-Series 6 that I had the good fortune of watching the Halloween episode with people on the night, so I think maybe that's ever since then it's coloured my. It might have been a bit of a solitary thing before that, although I always recommend it after the event. But since I've been aware of the communal power, obviously it's never going to be that episode again. But that was fun. But yeah, I should say because I put it number one, you put it number two. Mr. King is our sort of series winner here, if you want to aggregate them in the same way that what was it called? Lip Service in Series 6 was.
Nice. Okay.
If you tot it up, that was our joint favourite. So I mean, it's always impossible to answer really, but just because Series 6 and Series 7 are the only two that we've covered episode by episode like this. Any feel on whether, and I know Series 6 might be a bit distant in your memory, I listened back to our rankings of them, just the end bit, this bit basically. Any idea whether this is stronger? Because I said that these are an interesting two to group, not just because we've looked at them like this, but because for them they've been their pandemic years,
Yeah, do you know what? I have no sense, actually. No idea. Other than, I think, because you've got Last Night at the Proms at the end, I think slightly taints the entire series for me. And I wasn't. Am I gonna prove myself a liar again? I feel like I wasn't that mad keen on Wuthering Heist. I thought it was interesting, but slightly flawed. I'll go back and re-listen and discover that I said something completely different. I don't know. Again, because I think they've been conflated. The two of them have been put together. So I don't know that I could say 7 is better than 6 or vice versa. I think it would be interesting to do a top 6 out of all of those and see how many came from which series.
Well, this is getting back to the sort of double album thing, isn't it? Condensing the double album down.
That would be the only way to do it. And I wonder how many of them would come from season 6 and how many would come from season 7. And I would just be curious to know, in what order they were written and the scheduling, etc. Because obviously there's an interesting narrative here about them having to adapt halfway through due to COVID and filming schedules and having to do things slightly differently. So there's a deeper dive there to be had, I guess. But in terms of straight out saying season 6 or season 7, I don't think that's possible. I think I would have to take them as as a double album. I think I'd have to take it as one 12 episode series.
Or indeed, you could compare any of the series to each other. It's interesting that we've gone through them like this. I mean, it's funny for me. Series 6 is not as weighed down by Last Night at the Proms, but I also think Series 7 is arguably elevated because Mr. King's in it. So for me, that's enough to elevate it without the lead weight around the other series ankles sort of thing. But I suspect this might be. Again, it's all a bit arbitrary, but this might be the strongest series they've done since Series 4, which is good. I think that I don't think they ever tanked, but I think this is kind of there are more highlights here for me. Well, that was great. I really enjoyed talking about all that, and I'm glad that we managed to give each episode its due, hopefully, and it was fun to do a kind of give it its own strand, and I really enjoyed chatting to you about them. I hope we get to do so again.
Here's I'm going to pose one final question and just leave it hanging in the air, and then that's where we can leave it. Is did we ever think we'd be on Series 7? And I think it seemed unlikely actually that this would go for as long as it has, and as we've said before, the amount of faith that the BBC obviously have in it, and the amount of promotion that they keep giving to it, etc. Are they going to make 2 more and then finish?
Well, they've actually been renewed for 2 more. Did you see?
I don't think I did see that, but my question is, I have no question that they'll get to make 9 series. But will they stop there? Will they go, okay, well, that's the right time to bow out and then make 9 series and no more Inside Number 9?
Well, if they go for 9 series and we're assuming they are in 2023 and 24, that I think it started in 2015, was it 2014? So anyway, it would have done about a decade.
Yeah.
In full. That's quite something.
It is, yeah.
British television especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, kudos and congratulations and thank you and all, you know, quibbles and nitpicking aside, it's still something I look forward to and utterly enjoy. But I wonder if we've got 2 more series to go and then that's their swan song.
Yeah, well, here's hoping we live to see it. I was going to say.
Cheers, mate. That's really lovely.
Well, it's that year that you can say and I can't. You know, so that's the dominant mood. I just wanted to finish by saying I've played out every episode with some music or featured some music that's tangentially related to each episode, but I didn't do that for Merrily Merrily. So hopefully I'll think of something to stick at the end of this that'll make up for that, and we can put something, you know, vaguely owl related in the middle or something, you know. But yeah, we'll see what.
I know what you could do, David. You could play some Whoo.
Right. Yeah, that's why they pay you the big bucks.
Oh yeah,
that kind of stuff. Okay, well, say goodbye, John.
I actually wanted to do the. I want to give you a little sting that you can cut into the opening music. Actually.
Yeah. Is that just a seal being?
Yeah, it's that weird little synthesized noise that comes in at the beginning of the of the intro music.
Perfect.
Goodbye, John.
Perfect. Great.
Cut that together and cut out all the chutney.
Yeah, and I was going to say goodbye, John, as well. And goodbye from me, and see you again soon.
Just going to sit there and block that thing, or are you going to play some? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream.
Merrily, merrily, merrily,
Your boat
merrily,
gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream.
merrily, merrily.